There we go. All right. So one thing that just gonna preface it. Well, I'll introduce myself. So my name is Clemente Diaz. I'm from Brew College. It's part of the City University of New York. I am primarily an administrator, and then secondly, I'm an educator. So my regular 9 to 5 job includes managing several programs within the college, and then I also teach in the evenings. But that's again in addition to my day job. I say that just so you can get a general sense of the different type of opportunities that IO psychologists can do. So both Dr. Perry and my other colleague, Dr. Ronnie Rader Pullman, they're professors first and foremost. So they teach, they conduct research, apart from other things. And I'm on the reverse side, doing more administrative ends. The field of IO psychology is very broad in that sense, right? It's the application of psychology to the workplace. And if you've ever had any type of job, you know, the workplaces vary. So I don't want to spend too much time on this presentation, only because it seems as if many of you know what IO psychology is, at least from the chat box. And I really want to focus a bit more time on answering your questions, because I saw a lot of great questions in terms of getting experiences or how to just get into the field, so to speak. So for those of you who are not very well aware of IO psychology, it's, again, the psychology of the workplace, and it focuses on organizations as well individuals and teams within businesses or organizations in general. So key thing is that work is something that's fundamental to all of our lives. At some point or another, you will be working if you don't have a job already. And when we look at data, the vast majority of us will be working for a very long time, and we tend to work more than we do spend time with our family members or do other personal things. So work is a very important component of human life in general. And that's why it's important to study the workplace, study the dynamics within the workplace to ensure that we can make work just better for everyone and as effective as possible. So in IO psychology, or industrial organizational psychology, as I mentioned, is the study of the workplace, but it's the scientific study of working and the application of psychological principles in the workplace. Um, Individuals with a background in IO psychology are trained in the scientist practitioner model, which means that we're trained to be both producers of research, if that's maybe the path that we want to go to, as well as consumers of research and applying research that either we've done or others have done to make the workplace better. We apply the scientific method to study the various issues that arise in the workplace, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, issues on performance, leadership, motivation, things like that. And then we apply those research findings to make organizations much more effective and make employees much more effective as well. There are two areas within IO psychology, both there's the industrial part and the organizational part. This is going back to one of the questions in the chat box. IO psychology, business psychology, work psychology, occupational psychology, it's pretty much all the same thing. It just depends usually on what part of the world you're in regards to the name that's given. In the US, it's IO psychology. It's a very antiquated name, has its roots in the Industrial Revolution. It's something that maybe one day it'll change and it'll be like work psychology or work and organizational psychology. But for now, it's IO psychology. And it focuses on two aspects of the workplace that are very related. And oftentimes it can be a little difficult to differentiate the factors that fall neatly into industrial and neatly into organizational. For the industrial part, it's job analysis, looking at recruitment, selection, training of employees. So it's focusing a lot on the individuals within an organization. So it used to be called personnel psychology. So if you look at history books, for example, with HR, human resources, it used to be called personnel, the personnel department. But with time, things have developed kind of a more human side of business. Other aspects of the industrial part of psychology include research and practices on performance appraisals and then training and developing individuals within an organization. Job analysis focuses primarily on getting information about the knowledge, skills, and abilities required for a job. So job analyses can be done in various ways. I'm not going to, again, spend too much time on the specifics, but job analyses are conducted to get a better sense of what gets done in a particular role. And then that job analysis is used to create a job description. And ideally, once the job analysis is done, job description is done, when someone's being interviewed for a role, they're being compared to that ideal candidate profile. So what's the ideal employee look like, right? This fictitious individual based off this job analysis and job description. And not so much comparing different candidates, even though it does happen, it's really looking at this candidate compared to the ideal candidate. And hopefully that helps reduce discrimination, and also helps making sure that whoever gets hired has all the necessary KSAOs, or knowledge, skills, and abilities, and other characteristics related to the role or the task at hand. Other aspects, as I mentioned before, recruiting, selection, and placement. So focusing on attracting people is the recruitment part. Selecting is ensuring that those who are recruited, or who are the roles marketed to, essentially, are properly vetted through job interviews and other aspects. And then ideally that one or two candidates gets hired. And ultimately, at least on the end of the organization, making sure that that candidate is the most suited individual for that role. One thing that you'll notice within the workplace, oftentimes that does not happen. And that's really where IO psychology and IO psychology research comes in, to try and inform the decisions of HR leaders and other business leaders, to ensure that they're implementing best practices and evidence-based practices in making their decisions for recruiting, selection, and placement of employees. Personnel selection is one of the oldest topics in IO psychology, and it oftentimes uses different instruments to determine, or to help filter out the best and maybe the not so best candidates for a position. Not sure if anyone saw the documentary Persona on HBO Max, talking about personality assessments. If you saw it, I would recommend you look at PsyOp's commentary regarding the film, just because it gives a one-sided approach. Personality assessments are one of many effective ways of filtering out candidates for a role, especially if they're done, if the type of assessments that are used are those that were scientifically developed. They're reliable, they're valid, and have a lot of research backing to show their effectiveness and their ability to predict behavior. Other aspects include intelligence assessments, which focus on cognitive abilities or other traits, interviews, using structured interviews versus just meeting with someone and kind of going with the flow. Even though interviews are not the best predictors of future performance or the best way to select candidates, it's one of many tools within an HR professional's or someone who is required to interview and hire people's toolkit. And then, as mentioned before, the general mental abilities, the Big Five, is considered the kind of the Rolls Royce of personality assessments, and then interviews as another component. Worker performance, which is important to evaluate and document the performance of employees. And this is really done for various reasons. So to ensure proper promotions, and to assess who needs additional training to maybe take on additional roles or to be promoted, or needs additional training to ensure that the work that the organization expects this person to perform gets done in the most effective manner, as well as giving rewards and oftentimes terminating employees as well. And then from the organizational side, we have factors that focus a bit more broadly. So for example, attitudes and emotions, teamwork, what are the dynamics involved in teamwork to ensure that individuals can work collaboratively and be as effective together as, or to be as effective as possible. Leadership, culture, things like that. Again, things a bit more broad and kind of more big picture. At the individual level, the organizational side, again, looks at attitudes, so such as job satisfaction. What does that entail? How can one ensure that employees are satisfied within a job? Organizational commitment, so ensuring that individuals are committed to the organization and are willing to go above and beyond. So engaging in organizational citizenship behaviors as an example. Organizational justice theory, in which employees pay attention to the fairness of how they're being treated. And oftentimes that has an impact on their performance if they feel that they're not being treated fairly, or there's no justice in their eyes in organizational practices. At the teamwork level, teams are defined as two or more individuals with a common goal. Oftentimes in the workplaces, people are lumped together. And I wouldn't, and I would argue that my colleagues as well wouldn't say that those are teams, those are groups. Ensuring that a group of individuals becomes a team is something that takes time and effort, and something that organizations have to manage effectively if they want that group to be cohesive and to be as productive as possible. And then leadership, looking at how leaders influence others towards a common goal, usually the vision of the organization or the organization's mission. And then how leadership has been focused on throughout the years has varied from specific traits that people may or may not possess to specific styles which are best suited for certain situations. Other topics in the organizational umbrella, DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, looking at discrimination law, looking at team dynamics with respect to, is there inclusion occurring within the team? Do all group members or team members feel that there's a sense of psychological safety where they can speak up and talk about tough issues within their group or their team? And I think it's important to understand that kind of in a bigger picture, the world that we're living in is ever changing. And that's why IO psychology is so beneficial and important to organizations and for students to explore, even if they don't want to go into IO psychology, but just having a basic understanding of it, because the research and the theories that get generated through IO psychology can have huge impacts in terms of how organizations operate and operating effectively. So consider, for example, the gig economy. A lot of individuals having jobs, whether it's Uber Eats, or other jobs where you're going from gig to gig, right? Or certain technologies possibly eliminating jobs, but also looking at, while some jobs may be eliminated, other jobs are being created because you're going to need individuals who are going to be able to maintain those technological systems. Remote work, due to the pandemic. For example, at my particular institution, prior to the pandemic, it was unheard of that individuals would work from home. And anytime you would ask, hey, is it possible to work from home? It was always frowned upon. And now that we were kind of thrown into remote work and we've been doing it for roughly a year, I see it as something that will, the institution will have to come up with some sort of policy in terms of allowing remote work and showing that we have been just as effective, maybe not necessarily in the beginning when we were trying to understand the transition and kind of deal with hiccups and challenges, but in the long term, we've demonstrated that we're able to effectively work remotely, and that's something to be considered. And that's a big way that IO psychology plays roles in that ever-changing world of work and looking at best practices, doing research on new topics that may arise within the workplace to ensure that, again, businesses are as smart as possible and are effective as possible. In terms of career paths, someone asked the question in the chat box earlier, what does a job description look like for someone in IO psychology? I would say there's no real job description. It really varies. The application of IO psychology or the psychology of work can be applied to various industries. So whether it's academia, being a professor, teaching, being an administrator within an institution of higher education, doing consulting work, working in different organizations, whether they're nonprofits, big corporations, banks, and so forth, working for the government. One thing that you'll notice is that you'll rarely find a job description that says IO psychologist in it. And this is the same for a lot of other fields, but particularly IO, you'll find opportunities that focus on the skill set that IO psychologists have but not necessarily the name. So that could be within human resources, it can be within consulting, it could be management, and so forth. Or in my case, my official title is Associate Director of College Now. Right? If you were to look at that title at face value, like that has nothing to do with IO psychology. But I assure you, there are plenty of IO related things that I do within my role, whether it's directly or indirectly. So sometimes you have to go beyond the job titles and really look at the job descriptions to see how one would be able to apply their knowledge in IO psychology. And if it's not very clear, being able to make those connections within the job description yourself. And then if you're interested in pursuing a career in IO psychology, there are numerous programs throughout the US that you can look at, whether it's at the master's level or doctorate level. Keep in mind that unlike some other fields within psychology, you don't necessarily need a doctorate degree to do IO psychology work. In comparison to my colleagues, I only have a master's degree in IO psychology. It oftentimes, will limit the type of opportunities, just like anything else. The higher education and training you get, the more opportunities that become available to you. But there are a wide variety of opportunities available to those with a master's degree in IO psychology. And it's also one of the fastest growing careers in the US. For the listing of graduate programs, as well as other information about different career paths and things that you can do within IO psychology, check out the SIOP website, which is the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, for more information. All right, and then in terms of questions, I know, again, there were numerous questions. So maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll go to the questions, start answering some of those.
I think one that has come up lots of times that we might want to address is, how is HR different from IO psych, or how are those related? Do you want to address that?
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to IO and HR, they tend to be very interrelated. The big difference is the focus. So when it comes to IO psychology, the focus is on science, on research, making sure that there are evidence-based practices being implemented within organizations, right? So it's following that scientific method. On the flip side, HR tends to focus more on general management practices, which may or may not have evidence behind them. So, an example, and I highlighted this earlier about the persona documentary, the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So it's the largest or the most commonly used personality assessment. Many HR professionals use it, many coaches use it. But there's not a lot of evidence. I would actually say there's no evidence to support its use. I'm a staunch advocate against using the MBTI, but oftentimes, I'll have colleagues within HR say, hey, I use it for training and development purposes. And again, you can see the distinction there in terms of, as an IO practitioner, my focus is to start looking at what are these fads and looking at the evidence before I decide if I'm going to use them. An HR professional, for the most part, would say, well, this is being used heavily within the HR field. All my colleagues use it, I'm going to use it. And it may be because they may or may not have training in understanding kind of how the scientific method works, or evidence-based practices, and kind of looking at the research behind a particular topic or intervention or instrument.
Yeah, one of the things I said as I typed an answer to one of those was the training and statistics and scientific method is much stronger in an IO psychology program versus an HR master's program. So you'll get a lot heavier focus on the reliability and validity of testing and assessment, and what we actually do and how it affects employees from a statistical perspective is all important. Yeah. The IO psych, you get a lot more training there.
Yeah, and additionally, I would say HR, if you want to kind of look at the positive, I guess, right? HR is a lot more cemented within the business industry or the business field than IO psychology is. So the jargon, the terminology that's used is very aligned with what you would hear in businesses. IO psychology, since it's a science, is focusing on research, tends to have its own jargon and terminology that oftentimes it doesn't necessarily jive with the workplace. And sometimes you have to kind of find that balance of, how am I going to convey the research that I've conducted or what I know works and doesn't work in the terminology that's used in the workplace, right? Am I going to be saying sample sizes? They may or may not understand what I'm talking about, right? That's just pro with respect to, I guess, the HR side, if you want to go into like the business side of applying information.
2 points that I want to make. One is, so I teach at a IO psychology program. So Dr. Perry teaches in a business school. I teach in a psychology department in an IO program. We have both a master's and a PhD program. Our master's students, many of them end up with what are traditionally viewed as HR jobs, but they have to translate what they know into HR speak, right? So the transition can be done and can be done easily. What I would argue, though, is that our master's students and PhD students have a much broader and a variety of positions that they're qualified for with their degree that cover more than HR. So you could do HR with an IO degree, but you could do other things as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ronnie, do you want to build on that and say where in the organization do your graduates tend to go in their first jobs?
It really varies. A lot of our PhD students end up in external consulting firms. So companies like Gallup, like Connexa, like Aon, those are large consulting firms that send their employees to customers who purchase IO solutions. So they don't want to do their own development of selection or leadership programs or performance management programs, and they hire a company that would do it for them. So everybody knows Gallup. They're famous for their surveys, but the money that they make is actually from their consulting work. We have a lot of students that end up being internal to the organization. So they work for companies like Microsoft or Starbucks or Dell Computers or large local businesses in HR, typically in the HR department or training department or performance management department. Again, there are a variety of names that you will see depending on the role that they have. Let's see, there was trying to check the question, and of course now it's stuck. Here we go. So
Another
how do
one, go ahead.
I start or begin my IO Psych career?
Yeah.
I can tell you what I look for when I look at applicants that apply to our program. And I would recommend checking on the SIOP website. There's a listing of graduate programs. Different graduate programs have different requirements. You really want to familiarize yourself with those requirements and make sure that you meet them before you apply. So in addition to a psychology degree, or at least a minor in psychology, that's a requirement for many, many programs. And having some basic statistics courses, a statistics course would be a requirement for most programs. Some of you asked about a minor. A business minor is great, but I've also had, for example, students with a statistics minor, which is delightful. I had students with an English minor, made my life easier when they were writing. So, I would say get a minor that you can do well in, get your GPA up, and don't worry too much about, this would look better than that. But if you don't have a preference, I would say a business minor is great. Almost all PhD programs that I'm aware of would require research experience, meaning that you have worked with a faculty member in a lab doing research. For those of you that are in programs where there's an IO degree offered and you have an IO faculty, try to work with that faculty. But if you do not have that, any research experience is better than no research experience. And more research experience looks better than less. So try to get involved in research to the extent that you can. Many of those research experiences, unfortunately, will be on a volunteer basis, unpaid, although I'm seeing a movement in certain schools towards allowing, or having more paid opportunities. I also got asked at a different forum, what about programs where, I'm a small college, we don't have really any research? Reach out to a large college near you. And especially now when everybody's moved online, my lab meetings are online. What do I care if somebody's on the other side of town or, the other side of the US? There are certain things, obviously, that can't be done online once we resume life as normal, like running subjects face to face. That's going to be tough. But, Dr. Perry mentioned we collected survey data through the internet from people that work remotely. All of that can be done online. So reach out to those faculty member. What can they say? Worst case scenario, they tell you they don't need the help.
Yeah, and I'll add that before I went to grad school, I didn't have any experience in research because I was actually a computer science major in my undergrad, and then I worked for 4 years in industry. And I came around to find IO Psych and felt like it was a good fit for me. And I reached out to a consultant that was local in my area. She was actually a member of an advisory board of a professional networking organization I was a part of. And she had me do a research project for her. So, you can get creative, especially if you're already out of school. I saw one person asked about that. Look for local IO psychologists in your area. PsyOp has a directory of sorts. I think you can probably search for people on there to try to just find someone and network and see if you can help them with something. Like Ronnie said, it will be volunteer most likely, but even just a little project will help on your resume.
Yeah. One of the questions was whether IO psychologists end up in more progressive businesses in progressive regions. And what I found is that it doesn't matter. They're all over the place in progressive industries, less progressive industries. I'm located in Omaha, Nebraska. We have some of our graduates placed in Union Pacific Railroad, not the most progressive industry you would think of. But we also have people placed in tech startups and so forth. We're in the middle of the country. Amazingly, a lot of IO programs are actually in the middle of the country and not so much on the coast. Let's see.
Do y'all want to comment on the online versus in-person programs? I don't know if you have any insight.
I think it really depends on the online program. I have had some unfortunate experiences with online programs where I would get students calling me asking for help because they couldn't get it from their own online program, where basically they were told, go ask at your local college. And I think that's just wrong. I'm not familiar with many of the online programs, so I think you really need to do your work, research on the quality of the program.
And one thing with respect to the online, because I teach, apart from working at Baruch College, I teach at the CUNY School of Professional Studies that's predominantly online programming and online degrees. So in the graduate program where I teach, it's a fully online MA in psychology with a track in IO Psych. You really should understand or really look into whether online learning is the best for you. When I was in grad school, it was traditional brick and mortar, but there were times I took some online classes. And for me, it was not my preference. I prefer to be in a classroom, face-to-face with the instructor. So I know I've had students who thrive in the online environment. I have students who struggle. So I think you really have to understand what's your preference and in which format you're going to do better, right? Sometimes you need that accountability of, I need to go after work. I'm going to go into my classroom. I'm going to, interact with my classmates, because if I don't have that accountability, I'm probably not going to do any of that. right? Or I'll just kind of show up to the online lectures, do the lecture and be gone unless there's a group project, right? So sometimes you may need that accountability.
And there are pieces of graduate work that go beyond the classroom. I think a lot of classroom instruction can be done well online, but it's that mentoring and forming a relationship with your advisor that is such an important part, in my opinion, of graduate school. And actually, Sarah just talked about it in terms of the remote work, right? You need to put a lot more effort into it when you're remote. And again, some programs do a great job, and they have dedicated faculty that are willing to put the extra work and get the support from the university to do that, and some programs do not. So I think that's an important part to consider. I think sometimes you think that a master's degree or a PhD is just a little bit more than a bachelor's, but it's really very different, and that mentoring is an important part of it.
I want to interrupt here just to say we are at time, but we'll continue answering questions. So if anyone has to leave, just check back to that Sign Up Genius link. I'll share it again in the chat. That's where I'll post the link to the recording. So if you want to catch the end, if you have to leave, just so you know. I know both of you had a couple other questions to answer.
Yeah, there's one question, and I see that it's popped up more than once. So Julia asked, as a college student, what are companies that you recommend looking into for summer internships? And then someone asked a similar one in terms of particular companies. One thing that I will say is, for the most part, every company has an HR department, right? So while I wouldn't give any specific companies, it's a matter of understanding that companies have HR departments, and they're usually in need of some sort of interns or part-time or full-time employees. The type of opportunity you'll have in those HR departments are going to vary, right? Whether it's a recruiting internship, training and development internship, or what have you, or maybe something more broad where you're doing a little bit of everything. So even if a company doesn't have job opportunities or internship opportunities posted for HR or something more IO related, go on the company's website, look up the HR department, see if you can find the director of the HR department, send them an email. Hey, this is my background, here's my resume, any opportunities that you may have available either now or in the near future. And oftentimes that can kind of put them, maybe that person hasn't thought of having an intern before, and he's like, hey, maybe I should, right? So it's a matter of just being very, casting a wide net. And when I used to work in career services, we used to tell students, cast a wide net, think of it as a funnel. You apply to a large number of opportunities, you get less interview, or you hear back, right, from less organizations, and then hope you're going to find something. You have to cast a wide net.
Yeah, that answers a question earlier. I accidentally said that we answered, but we hadn't yet. Apply to as many things as you can, as you think would be interesting to you, and just see how it goes. It's best to cast a wide net. I'll add one more. There was one where I answered on the Q&A. Another form of experience besides HR type experience could be research lab experience. To work in a research lab as a lab manager or as a formal research assistant, a job title like research assistant can be helpful on a resume as well.
Yeah. Somebody asked about undergrad that is not a psychology undergrad. Most places will admit you if you do not have a degree in psychology. Some won't even care. Some will ask for the equivalent of a minor in psychology, which is somewhere between 12 and 15 hours of psychology. So it's really something you could probably make up fairly easily. So don't let that be a barrier.
Yeah, and like I said, I was a computer science major, and I know I'm not super ordinary and normal. You don't see a lot of those in IO Psych, but I know another member of my cohort was a political science major, and both of us had good industry experience. So that work experience, I think, helped us get in, as well as our research experience.
I have another question here. What skills and experiences do you need or would help on your resume to get a job? So as we mentioned before, in terms of whether it's getting actual internship experience or doing research work, in terms of the specific skills, I'll direct students to two things. If you Google the skillful psychology student, there's a guide from APA, the American Psychological Association, which outlines 5 different skills or categories of skills that all psychology majors, and you know, this applies if you're getting an undergrad in psychology, these 5 categories, so cognitive, communication, personal, social, technological, and includes analytical thinking, critical thinking, creativity, oral communication, collaboration. Those type of skills are the skills that employers are looking for. So if you're able to translate this from your undergraduate degree into a resume, fantastic. The second thing is there's an organization called the National Association of Colleges and Employers, NACE. They work with employers to develop what they call the 8 career competencies. These 8 competencies are the competencies or skills that employers most often want from recent graduates, right? Regardless of field. So even if you don't have a psychology degree, you got, you know, computer science. These are skills that employers across the board, across industries want from graduates. And they include critical thinking. So again, kind of relates back to the psychology one, oral and written communication, teamwork, digital technology, leadership, professionalism, career management, and global intercultural fluency. So again, you can Google the Skillful Psychology Student or NACE's career competencies, and they'll give you a breakdown of those specific skills that employers want.
I want to tackle the misconceptions about IO psychology. I have 2 that I hear a lot about. One is that we are clinical psychologists in the workplace. I actually have a t-shirt that we created that said, "I'm not that kind of psychologist." So no, we're not that kind of psychologist. We cannot do therapy. We're not providing clinical or counseling services. Not at all. The other one is that if you get a PhD, you have to go the academic route. That is not true. Actually, in our program, about 95% of our students with a PhD end up in industry, in businesses, in consulting firms, in organizations, in government, not in academia. So that's another misconception. If you want to work in industry, you definitely can get your PhD and be very successful. Do you guys encounter other misconceptions?
I think those are the main misconceptions. And the third is not so much of a misconception. It's more of when you tell someone, "Hey, I'm doing IO psychology." I'm like, what the heck is that?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. People usually don't know what it is.
Yeah.
We got asked, what is an Iowa psychologist in a meeting? So
Like a psychologist in Iowa, apparently.
apparently, it's right across the river from us. So
This one's good about PSYOP. PSYOP is an excellent resource, and you can get involved as an undergrad. We've had an increasing number of undergrads come to the conference in recent years. Definitely, it's a good resource for all things IO Psych, and it's the main go-to kind of conference and professional organization for IO Psych.
And then there's a question here, at what level do you start working at when you first graduate and work in the field? So I think that probably, I'm not sure if the person's an undergrad or grad student, but I always tell students, get experience, right? Don't expect to go to grad school and just because you have a graduate degree, you're gonna get a job. Those students are what I call unemployed. While you're getting your education, you should start developing skills and gaining experiences that are gonna make you marketable, first and foremost. And secondly, ideally experiences in the chosen area that you want to go into, right? So you can start kind of developing that skill set in training and development, in recruiting and selection, whatever area you want to go into. That's what's going to make you employable. First and foremost, employers seek out skills. The degree is kind of like the frosting on the cake.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, in comparing, say, my HR undergrads to students who get a master's or a PhD in IO Psych, or even an HR master's, you're going to go in at a higher level in a more strategic role with a graduate degree. That's just kind of generally happens. You can't promise it happens every time, but you will go in at a higher salary level in a higher, more strategic position generally if you get a graduate degree.
This is an interesting question. Is there any difference in course structures in IO between the US and England? If I was to pursue a master's in England, would that carry over well into the United States job market?
I have no idea.
I have no idea as well. I would argue, and this is just my experience having worked in career services for many years, what employers are going to want are the skill set, right? If you have the skills that the employer in the US is looking for, you'll find a job, whether you got your degree in the US or not. Because again, the degree is kind of like the frosting on the cake. They want specific skills. And if you can bring that to the table, regardless of where you got your degree from, you'll be fine.
Yeah, I think that's
Thing
right.
that I will say, and this is kind of, I guess, on the flip side, if you wanted to get a degree in the US and go to England, I know abroad a lot in the UK, IO psychology is considered, it's called work and occupational psychology. You can actually get, it's not licensed, but you get certified. So there's different certification and licensure kind of requirements for specific degrees. So you may get a degree from here in IO psychology. That doesn't necessarily mean it meets the educational requirements for those certifications in the UK to become a certified and things like work occupational psychologist.
Yeah, and the difference in those, we haven't talked about that, right? Licensure. So if you want to be a licensed, if you want to call yourself a psychologist, then you need a license. And in the US, and really maybe even by state, it's,
Yes,
you have
there
to
are
take
differences.
yeah, so across states, so you have to pick out you have to maybe ask about that if that's something you're interested in. But you have to take a test, and the test generally covers all areas of psychology. I know a friend took the test in Texas 10 years ago now, but she was learning pharmaceutical information from clinical psychology to be able to take the test. But now she can call herself an IO psychologist, and she has her own consulting business, and that was important to her for having her own business. We're all IO psychologists, but we can't, if we aren't licensed, we can't really say that as in terms of like selling our services.
Yeah. And that goes for other areas of psychology. More often than not, it's counseling and clinical that gets licensed because they're working with individuals providing therapy. So even if you want to go into educational psychology, you want to go into health psychology, if you're not licensed, technically speaking, legally speaking, you're not a psychologist. That's just the US for you.
And a couple of people asked about accreditation, and that's where it's related. Clinical and counseling programs are accredited for the licensure reasons. IO programs are not. Many of our students that are practicing don't get licensure at all, and they're very successful. You do not need that to be a practicing IO psychologist. To dovetail over that, somebody asked if you have a master's in counseling but want to transition into an IO program for a PhD, how easy would it be? I've had a number of students that had a counseling degree and got a PhD in IO. They had to do more coursework because a lot of their counseling coursework didn't really help. They needed the IO relevant coursework. Counseling programs are not usually heavy into statistics as much as IO programs. So they had some catch up to do in terms of their master's program. But they were very successful and did great work. So I really don't think that's an issue. You have the background in psychology that is transferable. Just know that you'll have to, it's not going to be the same as somebody coming in with a master's in IO. You won't have some of that same background.
We have a question here. What qualities does the ideal IO psychologist have, and what do you need to succeed in the field? Like anything in psychology, it depends. As we've highlighted, I don't think there's an ideal IO psychologist. It all really depends on where you're going to be applying your knowledge and expertise industry-wise, right? Whether you're going to be a researcher, are you going to be a professor, are you going to work in government, academia as an administrator like myself. The skill sets that are going to be needed are going to be dictated for the most part by that industry and by the role that you're going to be in. And that's what's going to determine whether you're an ideal IO psychologist in that role. The skill set for a researcher is going to vary for that of someone who's at, who teaches at a predominantly teaching institution, right? That doesn't necessarily focus on research, and is going to vary for someone who's an administrator. And, you know, again, whether you're a consultant and so forth. So it really depends. That's the famous phrase in psychology. It all depends.
Yeah. A couple of questions about a bachelor's degree in IO. Most universities do not offer a bachelor's degree in IO. What I have seen is a bachelor's degree in psychology with a concentration in IO, but the degree is in psychology. So again, I would go to those recommended, the recommended information that Clemente gave from APA in terms of the skill set that you get as a psychology major. And that would apply.
I'll say, where I work, Baruch College, they do have an undergraduate degree in IO psychology, but it's within the business school. So the vast majority of courses that students take are business courses. And then you probably take, I think it's like 5 or 6 IO psychology courses. So I don't see it as a true IO program, even though it's a BBA in IO psychology. I received my undergrad from Baruch as well. And the way I went around it was getting a BA in psychology. And then apart from the required psychology courses I needed to take, all those other psych courses, I made sure they were IO specific. So I say I got an IO undergrad because I took probably like 10 or more IO specific courses. And then someone asked a very specific question because it's for Baruch. So they said, does Baruch offer any research opportunities for undergraduates looking to apply to the grad program? So in terms of opportunities for undergrads trying to apply the graduate programs, there are opportunities. It really depends on the professor, whether they're paid or unpaid. So a lot of professors do have grants and they're able to provide some sort of funding for their graduate assistants. And, you know, Baruch has, again, the undergrad, the master's, and a doctoral program in IO psychology. So there's a lot of faculty members in IO psychology. So a lot of opportunities. In the event that the internship or the research opportunity is not paid, you can get academic credit for it. So I know in undergrad, I had both opportunities. I did work with some IO faculty that was unpaid and I got credit for it. And then on the flip side, I did research work and got paid for it. So it really depends on the faculty member and what sources of funding they have for their labs.
Somebody asked about a minor in economics. I think, again, any minor that you enjoy taking would be beneficial. I don't think that matters, and economics are great.
Yeah, I think you get more statistics in economics than a lot of other undergrad majors. So in that way, or minors, in that way it would be very helpful.
Yeah. And somebody asked, is there a lot of advanced math? Not necessarily. It depends on how your statistics courses are taught. I teach statistics without using advanced math. I focus on interpretation and understanding of what the statistics tell us. But in some places they do the work with advanced math. So again, it would vary by institution.
And we have a question here, I think it's Z Dong. A lot of schools only offer IO programs in business departments. Should I apply to them or just to those in the psych departments? What's the difference? A lot of IO psychologists who teach in business departments. So that's nothing strange. What I would probably argue is that the overall degree requirements may vary if the IO program is in a business school or in a psych department. So for example, this was a few years ago, Baruch College had 2 master's degrees, one within the business school, one within the psych department. Those who were getting their master's in the business school had to take marketing, HR, accounting, so the business core, apart from their IO courses, and those who were pursuing their master's in IO in the psych department had to take psych courses. They didn't have to take accounting, marketing, and so forth. So it's a matter of which catches your attention more. Do you want to kind of get exposed to some of those other business areas? Or do you want to focus primarily on the psychological aspect of IO psychology? I know when I pursued my graduate degree, I wanted psych courses more than anything else. Because I saw that those courses weren't necessarily offered in business programs in IO, and that's what caught my attention. And some of those are the things you can either learn afterwards, and if you get a certificate or get certifications, or sometimes just on the job training, you'll get a better sense of how marketing works in the organization or other business practices.
I would also mention that some business schools focus on training academics only. So the PhD in business really focuses on getting you to a teaching position or a research position at a university, whereas in IO programs, you get the scientist practitioner model where you're prepared typically to do both. So if that matters, again, I would check the specifics of the schools and determine if that's their approach.
I have another very specific question to me. Can you technically do a double major, finance and IO Psych at Baruch? No. Baruch is weird, just because the Zicklin School of Business is weird, in my opinion. They have a lot of prerequisites, a lot of kind of red tape. You cannot do a double major if you're majoring in business at Baruch. You can do a double major if you're majoring in liberal arts. So if you're getting a psychology degree, you could do a double liberal arts degree, but not business, unfortunately.
Okay. Good software to learn. I would say R.
Yeah, that's what I keep on hearing.
I don't know. I have not learned it yet, but that's what people tell me. So
another one that I will say is, which oftentimes gets students don't think about, Excel. If you're going to go a more business route, right, instead of, let's say, doing research, you want to work in a company, do practitioner-oriented work, 9 out of 10 times businesses, where, again, this was when I worked in career services, would say students don't have the Excel skills that we're looking for. Because you would think maybe they have more sophisticated systems and software that they're using, but they heavily rely on Excel more often than not. So if you can, learn Excel, advanced functions and shortcuts and all that.
Are there any grad schools that have specifically good IO Psych programs? Yes, and it depends on your criteria. Over the last 4 or 5 years, SciOp has put together a whole bunch of papers depending on what your metric is, whether, for example, it's number of publications in IO-specific journals or student satisfaction or interdisciplinary work. You're going to get a different ranking of programs. What I would caution you is to say that the U.S. News and World Report rankings are not necessarily accurate.
Yeah,
and Ivy schools do not have IO programs. Period. None of the Ivies have an IO program.
They're not cool. For your previous question, one thing that I want to highlight, and I wish I had the exact link for the article, but I don't, I'm sorry. If you go to the SciOp website, go under TIP. TIP is the quarterly publication. It's a free publication. You can click on it. And one of the previous editions had rankings based off of alumni. So how alumni ranked their programs, and it gave the metrics and kind of what the rankings were based off several criteria. So that may be useful in terms of you making a better informed decision regarding a program. Oh, someone said they saw an MBA IO program at Harvard. Again, I would probably argue similar to Baruch's, it's not a true IO program because the vast majority of your courses are business courses, and then you probably take 4 classes in IO psychology. So I would argue it shouldn't be called an IO program, just because it's kind of like you're getting an MBA and a minor in IO psych.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion.
So it looks like we have one more question that we've all been avoiding, more of a research-oriented question about interview bias, that interviewees tend to fall into the major biases of interviewees, possibly, from the perspective of the interview.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I'm so focused on the interviewer biases.
Well, I don't know. One thing that comes to mind is oftentimes interviewees feel as if they have to change who they are for the purpose of an interview to make sure they land that opportunity. When I would argue, be yourself. Yeah? If you don't get that opportunity, maybe you weren't suited, and it's a mutual thing, right? It may be that you faked kind of the interview, so to speak. You got this role, and then you find out this is not where I wanted to be, and it's because you presented yourself as someone who you aren't, right? Oftentimes, an interviewer who's been properly trained will be able to pick up on certain things, like, will this person actually be happy in this role? Will they be happy in this organization? And that may be the reason you don't get the job, right? So those, I feel like it's always a two-way street, and sometimes it's better to present your true self. And if you don't get it, it's for a reason. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, and I'm going to mispronounce the name, so I'm not going to even try. Mr. Mrs. Ms. whatever Sabor. Depending on the metric, you're going to see very different programs rise to the top. If you look at student satisfaction, you get one ranking. If you look at alumni responses, you get a different one. If you look at the research productivity or grants that are awarded, you're going to get a separate one. If you look at interdisciplinary programs, and the reason I bring it up is because we did very well in that category, you're going to get a different ranking. So I think what you want to do is go to TIP. All of those papers are in TIP over the last 2 or 3 years, and identify the programs that either have multiple high rankings or those that you care about. Maybe you don't really care that they publish in the top IO journals. Maybe you care more about what their current students are saying about them or what their alumni are saying about them.
This question,
And I don't know off the top of my head, who ranks the highest in terms of research and experts, access to research and experts. But I do know research is one of the criteria that they look at, and access to like hands-on consulting experience is another metric they look at. So if you look at those articles, they're very helpful in terms of giving you different things to look at.
Mm-hmm.
This question was asked in the chat box about PsyDs and IO Psych. I know they exist. They're probably very few and far between. Very few.
It's the California School of Professional Psychology and the Chicago School of Professional Psychology that typically have them. What I will say about PsyDs is that you're unlikely to get any help in terms of an assistantship or help in your tuition, and they're incredibly expensive. So that's something you should take into account, is that you will have to pay quite a bit of money to get your degree in those programs. They're also, if you are planning to go academic, a lot of academic programs will not hire you as a faculty member with a PsyD, but will with a PhD. Again, if you're planning to go applied, less of an issue. But I would be concerned when most of the other programs in IO have reasonable tuition, and in many cases you get an tuition waiver as being part of a graduate program and having an assistantship. That's the way many of us paid for our graduate school. That's something to think about.
I think we should probably wrap here since we're at 8 o'clock Central. What we can do is, you have my email address. I'm going to put it in the chat again. So if anyone has remaining questions you want to ask, please, feel free to send me an email. And we've talked about doing these quarterly. So we'll try to focus on another subtopic in terms of research and in terms of the IO Psych field. So stay tuned for that. We're posting them kind of everywhere we can, and we'll send the announcement out to this group again if we can, to let you all know when it's going on. So thank you to Clemente and Ronnie for participating in this, and
thank you.
Thanks to everyone who came. So
thank you, guys.
We appreciate your interest. Have a good evening.